Right. I love that. Let's go to the fact of when were certain books included. A lot of talk is about the Gospels, the four Gospels. You know, Dan Brown had that whole deal in the Da Vinci Code. There was really 80 Gospels and only 4 were picked out, and that was political and blah, blah, blah. The fact is, let's talk about what actually happened in history. When did the early church start to recognize, how early did they recognize these 4 Gospels were the 4 Gospels they were going to include?
Well, if you start with Dan Brown's list of 80, I have no idea where he got that number. For one thing, we're not really sure how many Gospels there were that were circulating. However, what he's also suggesting is that this belongs in the earliest period when it doesn't. What we have in terms of documents are the 4 canonical Gospels from the 1st century. After that, we have Gospels that are written in the 2nd, 3rd, all the way up through the 9th century. And if you count all those documents from the 2nd to the 9th, is it even to the 11th maybe? For one of, I know you have Pseudo-Matthew that's 9th century. We're talking about 45 to 60 Gospels, something like that, but they're all later. That's the point. Now, that's the first thing I would argue is that let's look at the earliest materials we've got, those 4 Gospels. And one of the things that many people don't realize is that the modern book form we have today that is binding on the left side where you turn the pages, it's called a codex. That was invented probably the last decade of the 1st century. And we have very firm evidence that it was Christians who popularized this first, and they just took off with it. For the first 5 centuries AD, Christians had 80% of their books written on a codex, while as the rest of the world had only 20% of their books on a codex. So the Christians were the ones who were really using this far more than others. And some have suggested that perhaps the codex form was invented because it could incorporate more than one book, while as a roll or a scroll could only have something like the size of Luke in it. You couldn't put all 4 Gospels on it. So there's a suggestion that the original codex form used by Christians was to put all 4 Gospels on it. And therefore, you're able to spread this collection and get the news out about these are the books that we actually prize and treasure.
What are some of the statements that stand out to you as you go from the apostles to their students to the students of the students? And then you get these church leaders that are coming down the pike in this flow of consistent doctrinal belief. When did they start making statements to the effect that we recognize we've got 4 Gospels and 4 Gospels only?
Okay, well, what's happening in the 2nd century is this. If you look at the early portion of the 2nd century, talking now about the Apostolic Fathers, the generation that begins with First Clement, you know, studied under an apostle, but not an apostle themselves, and go to Justin Martyr, who's generally called to be the first of the apologists. There's a collection called the Apostolic Fathers that represent those books. If you look, and they generally represent the early part of the 2nd century, first half of the 2nd century. If you look at those works and you ask how often are books that now end up in the New Testament, how often are they cited? The answer is not as often as you would think. They're not cited that often. Now, there's a lot of material that's like what we see in the New Testament in there, so sometimes we can't tell, are we citing a biblical book, or are we citing a representation of the tradition that's represented in the biblical book, that kind of thing. That's not to get more complicated, but it's simply to say that people aren't citing books yet, they're simply presenting theology. We get to Justin Martyr and we get to Irenaeus. What's happened is that other movements have started to surface. As other movements have started to surface, they're writing books themselves that they are treating as authoritative for their kind of theology as a way of buttressing their theology. And so now we've got to begin to ask who's got the real deal and who doesn't. And so that process of dialogue starts to happen, and you start to get a sense of what the books are that represent what we believe.